the idea here is to make this as informal and as easygoing as possible, so that as you looking forward into your own project, you can find some ideas here that might help you anchor what you're going to do next. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Avi, who is a professional translator. He also is the proprietor of a translation and editorial services company. His background and experience is immense, and I thought he could get us started with a presentation on how he and many of his clients approach the project of bringing non-English language scholarship out into the English language scholarly world. So Avi, thank you for joining us, and I will just turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks so much, Chris. First of all, I want to thank you and the Institute for the opportunity to speak with scholars from the University of Tokyo this afternoon. I really am excited, being that we have already done a bit of work with some of the scholars at the University of Tokyo. I'm excited at the opportunity to be able to meet and greet additional scholars and to talk about how to open your research to the world. And what I mean by that is today we're going to discuss, in the time that we have allotted to us, how it is and why it's important, and how we go about taking our scholarship, which is in Japanese or in any other language, and how do we make that transition not just in a technical way, but also in an inherent way from Japanese and to getting to the stage where it's ready to be published in English. Before we take off and before we jump right into things, I want to bring everyone's attention to the link that I put at the top of the screen. I also put it in the chat, okay? If you are interested in receiving the slides from this presentation, if you want to go back to it at a later stage and check things or remind yourself of one of the topics that we've discussed today, all you need to do is click on this link, leave your name and email, and then I will email you within the next day or two with a link directly to the presentation. You'll also, as a side benefit, receive access once you put in your name and email. You'll receive access to our library of tools that you can access, which will help you. There are podcasts, webinars, blogs, all sorts of different tools that can help you in publishing your research. So that link is up here, and it's also in the chat. So I will give everyone 15, 20 seconds if you want to do that now, while we go and move ahead to the next slide. Okay, if you haven't finished yet, that's perfectly fine. Take your time, finish up, and you can listen to me in the background. So first of all, I want to start out by presenting talking about some of the reasons why it is that it's such a challenge to publish our research. And this is true both for academic papers as well as for book manuscripts. Today we're going to be focusing on book manuscripts, but a lot of the principles are the same with academic journals as well. So as you see here in the cartoon that I brought, the publishing process, especially for scholars for whom English is not their native tongue, not their native language, can be a very intimidating process, as there are many stages along the way that you need to both learn and go through in order to make sure that your research is ready for publication in English. And even after we go through all of that, there's still an 80% chance that the submission that we send, at least the first time around, will be rejected. That's true for book publishing as well as journals. And obviously that's a general statistic. It really depends on your specific field. In some fields it's more difficult, some fields it's less difficult. But regardless, it's a challenge. Now, despite that, I do want to explain that I think it really is critical to publish in English. And not because English has any value as a language, in my opinion, over any other language, but more because it enables the scholars in our field around the world to be impacted by the research that we're doing. And if we really believe in what we're doing as a field, as an area of research that contributes something, whether it's to just our immediate surroundings, our immediate colleagues, or whether maybe it has an impact on education, on schools, on government policy. I know that with the project that we're currently working on, there are a lot of practical ramifications that it can have a big impact on policy, environmental policy around the world. So it's really important that we don't limit ourselves to just publishing in Japanese, so that we have the ability to have a positive impact on those around us. And obviously it brings prestige to our institution, to our department, when we can take our research and have the ability to expand and make it much more broad than we currently are doing today. Okay, so now let's jump into what are the stages in preparing our manuscript. Let's say for right now that theoretically we have a manuscript that we've written in Japanese. Okay, it could be, maybe this is your doctorate, or maybe you've even written a book in Japanese. Now, how do we go about taking this book, and it's currently in Japanese, and publishing it in English? And what are the stages? So the first thing, which may seem a bit counterintuitive, but the first thing is actually to find a publisher. Now, most people only think about the publication and publisher stage after they've already translated the book, after they've finished that whole process. My recommendation is to actually think about that from the beginning, because that will impact the way that we edit our manuscript in Japanese and prepare for translation. By the way, this is also true if you've written your manuscript in English and want to edit it in English as well. We want to find a publisher. And that will give us some insight into what's the style in terms of what type of publisher it is, and what sort of manuscripts they're looking for. What's their bibliography? How do they deal with formatting issues? And if we can already get some sort of preliminary interest, or even if we're really lucky, a contract, even before we've prepared the entire manuscript in English, that helps us along the entire process. So how do we go about doing that? So first of all, we want to prepare what I call a publication package. Now, what is that? That includes a prospectus. A prospectus is something like an abstract. It summarizes the main points of your book. What is the biggest novelty? What are you bringing in this book that hasn't been discovered, that hasn't been discussed or really researched before? And what are you contributing? What's the novelty of your idea? And once we have that in place, then we can write a pitch or a prospectus, which is generally somewhere in the realm of 7 to 10 pages. It doesn't need to be terribly long. That summarizes the book. That way, if we send this publication package along to a publisher, they can quickly read through the prospectus and understand what it is that we are bringing to the table and why it should be of interest to them. Now, when we're writing this prospectus, it's important also to keep in mind some of the more maybe marketing subtleties, in terms of, if we know that we're submitting to Cambridge University Press, for example, and we know that Cambridge has an interest in monographs. I'm just throwing an example. So we want to focus on those points that really we think will be of most interest to the specific publisher that we're targeting. Now, how do we actually go about finding publishers? How do we know what's of interest? So in this regard, I think at a very simple level, the first thing we need to be doing is we need to be going to our library. And if Corona doesn't enable us to go to the library, so we can look online and we can see, okay, the main manuscripts in our fields that have really made an impact, that really that have influenced our writing, where are they published? And are there any trends? Are there any publishers that seem to have a specific interest in our niche? We can all try and aim and shoot for the top publishers, and we should. But the more that we can focus on which publishers are specifically interested in our field, the better chance we have when we make our submission that it's going to be of interest. Is it possible to submit a novel research that the publishers never published anything in that field and they'll be interested in taking it? Yes, but the chances of success are much lower. And really, we need to start looking through some of the other research, look through our own bibliography and see, okay, what publishers are interested in this sort of material. Now, even if we dig a little bit deeper, we might be able to find a relevant book series. The way that English publishers work, for the most part nowadays, is that they have certain series, which means they have a topic that they want to run through with different perspectives and different focuses. And if we can find a home for our manuscript that fits into a specific series of a specific publisher, which is even more specific, then we even increase our chances of being successful to an even greater extent. And finally, together with the publication package should include a number of different things. It should include the prospectus, as we discussed. It should include the table of contents, so they get a general idea of what is this book going to contain. And I also recommend that it should contain a very strong cover letter. Now, different publishers have different requirements. Some of them will say, don't send us a cover letter, in which case we obviously listen to that instruction. Some of them will ask for a cover letter, and some of them won't say either way. Now, the reason that I think it's important to have a strong cover letter along with a strong title and a strong abstract is because these publishers are receiving hundreds of submissions on an annual basis. And it's clear that they don't have time to really read through the full submission of every book that they receive. And therefore, the way that they judge your submission is by looking at the cover letter, by looking at the title, by looking at the abstract. In fact, this was actually proven statistically. I grabbed this image at the bottom of the page from a study that I saw recently, which basically showed what book reviewers or what editors of book series look at when they're looking at your paper. And the truth is that they're looking at your title, at your abstract or your prospectus, and less the full paper or the full manuscript. Unless we convince them, and we make a great first impression with our cover letter, with our title, with our prospectus, we won't get to the stage of being able to present the entire manuscript. So I actually recommend that we do this even before we get to the full publication, to the full translation or edit of our book. Because if we do this as a first stage, first of all, the commitment on our side, both monetarily as well as time investment that we need to make to put together a prospectus, is a fraction of what we need to do if we were trying to put together the entire book. Once we have a publisher that's interested, once we know that this is of value and someone thinks this is important and that they want it to be published, then we can continue the process and make sure that we finish up the work that we've started. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I do want to
Avi, this is Chris. Before you move on to the next slide, if I can interject really quickly here for this particular audience, everything that you've just outlined is great, and it's actually a big part of what the UT-IPI service here at Kodai is all about. So of course, Avi has advised his clients similarly, but as you're getting ready, you should feel free to come to us at UT-IPI to pull together any part of this at any stage that you want assistance, or through the whole thing. This is a big part of what we do here at UT-IPI.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I wanna reiterate what Chris is saying, and that is that I work with a lot of scholars at institutions around the world, and I think that you're in a unique position in that you have a support, both financially as well as scholarly support, that's available to you that's not available in most other institutions. So that's a real resource that's available to you that I really strongly encourage and recommend for you to take advantage of, and to use that to your advantage. Because it could be that you're saying to yourselves, well, I've never prepared a prospectus before. I don't even know what that looks like. That's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's why, obviously you can look online and try to find some best practices, but you can also, schedule a meeting, speak with Chris, and see, how he might be able to advise you. He has tremendous experience in the field. I also want to point to your direction further readings that I think will be really helpful as an extension of this workshop. The first one is from the UT-IPI website on writing for publication, 8 helpful tips. I read through this and I found this extremely helpful. It's a great summary of how to write for publication. We also on our website have a best practices for preparing your academic book for translation, which also expands on some of the themes that we're discussing today. So please, take the time to go through that afterwards. Okay, I want to, for a minute, discuss open access, and I did not discuss open access with Chris before we started, so I'd be curious to hear Chris's thoughts. But I think it's important.
Happy to share when the time comes up. Don't worry.
Okay, great. So I would say nothing short of a revolution in the world of academic publication. I will try to be as unbiased as possible in explaining the way I understand open access is that if until today or until a number of years ago, in order to access certain materials, we needed either to pay to access a certain article or to access research, or we had maybe access through our library, I assume. The open access movement comes to say, if scholarship is published, it should be available to any scientist around the world, regardless of their institution and regardless of their financial situation. And especially if universities are being funded by governments that are sponsoring this research, it should not be hidden behind a paywall. Now, that being said, the publishers obviously had what to say about the situation, and they are the ones that actually put out the research, and they're the ones who have a financial interest in this game. And the model that was created, I'm speaking in general terms, the model that was created is that in order to enable this open access revolution, in order to enable any scholar that wants to access any research in the world to be able to do so, the burden of the cost was transferred from the reader to the scholar who was trying to publish their research. Now, there are institutions where that is funded, and in many grant opportunities that you're going to apply for, you can put that in as a request that you want to cover open access. But regardless, it's not all of a sudden free for everybody. There is at least a subsidy that needs to be covered by the researcher or by the research institution themselves. So you do need to think about whether open access is a possibility. Obviously, in the vast majority of cases, or in all cases, we want our research to be read and to be available to as many scholars as possible around the world. And in a study that I saw recently, papers and books that are put out in open access get 4 times more views and 4 times more quotes in other publications than publications that are stuck behind some sort of a paywall. So even in terms of very pragmatic terms, in terms of our research making an impact, like we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, I think it's really important to understand that it's something that we need to be aware of and consider, and it's one of the factors that we need to think about when we are going and choosing a publisher. Now, we need to, obviously, certain times the cost can really be prohibitive if we don't have sponsorship, so that can be a challenge. There are different types, we won't get into the weeds here, but there are different types of open access publishing. There's open access publishing, which enables scholarship to be available right away the second it's published. There are some where it's closed for a certain amount of time and then opened after 6 months. So look into those issues before you start, before you choose a publisher. And then it's also worthwhile to be aware of Plan S, which is a plan that's being worked on in the European Union, which is basically, which is the European Union's way of saying that if we're going to fund your research through research funds, through research grants, excuse me, we want you to make your research available, and we're forcing you to use open access. It's not yet been implemented because there are a lot of issues that come up with it, but it's something to be aware of. Chris, did you want to chime in with your thoughts on open access?
I mean, I'm a huge fan of open access, but it's ironic considering the pay for journals and book series that I edit. My reasoning is along the lines of fair and open, making our research available to the world, which is the only thing that ever mattered to me. But I also, from a career perspective, I noticed as a journal editor that it's not 4 times, at least with the journal that I was editing, it's not 4 times, it was 100 times more citations.
Wow.
Because the paywall, especially for expensive journals, the paywall just limits who's going to use it. And even though a significant number of publishers have attempted to open up to the developing world. Anything that is easily accessible direct through Google gets cited, and that is the quintessentially publishing open access means that the first search is available free without any kind of blockage or security screen, and this creates an unbelievable number of citations for most articles.
Right. Yeah, it's citations, and I think it's also impact. I think, again, if we want to have an impact on our field, then our field needs to be able to read what we're writing. And when I say our field, I want to talk in the broadest possible terms. Like I said in the beginning, it's not just our small, maybe narrow, class of researchers that are in our field, but also how it impacts other researchers. I'm always shocked by who comes across papers that I've written many years ago, and what they do with them and how they use them, and we never know. We don't really know when we put our paper out into the world what impact it could have. Okay, I also want to discuss quickly what are called vanity publishers, as well as predatory publishers. So vanity publishers are publishers which are basically, they're not academic publishers, but they may publish academic works. And their model is basically that they charge a certain amount, often a hefty amount, in order to publish your research. And some of them have peer review, some of them have less peer review, and really they're a for-profit publisher that's trying to make money off your book in one way or another. Now, that's not necessarily bad inherently. It's just something that we need to be aware of, because the rigor with which they treat the review of your scholarship may not be as high as a proper academic publisher. And the cost may be prohibitive. One example, which I know has caused a lot of stir online, is the case of Cambridge Scholars Publishing, which, first of all, is a little bit tricky because it uses the name Cambridge, which leads scholars to think that it's a top-line publisher, and really it's a vanity publisher, meaning they do publish your work. It does go out into the world, but they charge you a hefty sum in order to do so. And it's not clear how careful their peer review and editing process is. Now, that is one type of publisher. Another type of publisher, which you really should avoid, are what are called predatory publishers. Predatory publishers are publishers that have basically jumped on the open access bandwagon and said, okay, if there's a charge for people publishing their work, we will set up a journal. Every week they set up dozens of new journals, and we will charge scholars to publish their research in our journals. And we're not really going to do any peer review. Oftentimes there's a website, they throw your article straight up onto the website. They'll say, congratulations, your article has been accepted without any review. They don't do any editing or any reference checking, none of that. And they just put it up on the website, charge you, $1,000, and, have made money. And then what you may not realize is that when someone is looking over your CV, and you've included an article from a predatory publisher, they may say, this doesn't count. This is sort of burning an article, so to speak, or burning even a full manuscript. So you want to be careful about that. Now, how do you know if something's a predatory publisher? Obviously, you should take a look at the names of who are the people who have published with this publisher. If the names are top leaders in your field, so then that's a good sign that it's a legit journal or a legit publisher. If you don't really recognize anybody there, then it's worth checking on Beall's list, or there are other lists that are also worthwhile to check out. Beall's list was a list that was originally curated by a professor, Jeffrey Beall, from the US, who basically just started making a list that's since then been updated by others on predatory publishers. But again, because there are so many new every week, there are new predatory publishers that are coming out, it's not necessarily a comprehensive list. So again, if you have any questions, you can check it with me, you can check it with Chris. We should be able to give you a good general idea about whether this is a publisher that's worthy of your consideration. Again, if we've done our homework originally and we've said, okay, we know what publishers we are leaders in our fields, and then we don't really run into these issues because we know who else is published in these places. So that's an important consideration. Now, let's talk for a minute about revising your manuscript in Japanese, okay? And this may come as a little bit of a surprise, but I don't think we have a choice but to do some fixes and some changes in the Japanese manuscript, even if it's already been published in Japanese, before we start working on translation, or if we translate ourselves and edit. We need to make some adaptations. Now, it is possible to do a translation first and then do some of the, and then conduct the changes. I recommend doing it in the Japanese if you can. I think it'll be easier for you, and I think it makes the translation process or editing process a simpler one as well. So what do you need to do? So first of all, it's important to do a cultural audit for your target audience. And what I mean by that is that there are certain modes of writing or accepted practices in a certain language that aren't as much in another language. So I'll give you a few examples. One example that I can tell you is Hebrew, which I'm very familiar with. Scholars tend to bring a lot of primary sources. You can have half a page of a primary source from another text, and there's nothing that people won't think twice. Whereas when you're publishing that same article in English, people say, why, focus on exactly what you want to say, on exactly what you want to bring, and don't bring me the entire page around that quote. And a lot of times that's an adaptation that needs to be made before the translation begins. Another example, which I came across once, was one time we were asked to translate a math book from Hebrew to Chinese. And in that case, there was an entire chapter based on a game called 5 Stones. Now, I don't know if this is a game that is played by children in Japan. I'd be curious to hear if it is. But basically, the concept of the game is you throw a stone up into the air, and then you try to grab the other stones while the one is in the air, and grab all the other ones in the interim without dropping any of them, and catch everything together. And there was a math concept that was based on this game. And the first thing that I realized is that there was an entire chapter in this book based on that concept. And I asked myself, do they have this game in China? And if they don't have this game in China, then this would totally be irrelevant in terms of the entire chapter. So we needed to rethink and reconceptualize, what is it, is this going to make any sense? And do we need to make any adaptations or changes based on the cultural context? Another example, which is related specifically, what we've noticed with the Japanese writers that we've worked with, is that there's a certain level of repetition of re-emphasizing arguments that have been made previously, maybe in order to support ourselves or back ourselves up, or show that our research is well based in the literature, which are very well accepted and are publishable in Japanese, but don't work as well in English. And part of the revision that we can do, together with whoever is helping us, is to try and look through our manuscript and see, okay, can I boil it down to the main arguments that I want to make in every chapter and every section, and can I cut down on some of the reinforcements that may not be critical, to make that distinction between what is an essential part of my argument that without it the argument won't be able to be made, and what are some of the support texts and documents and arguments that maybe can be revised or cut down on. Oftentimes, another point is about revising your manuscript in Japanese, is that oftentimes this is a text that we've published, maybe not recently. Already in the academic world, a manuscript that's a year or two old can already be somewhat outdated, depending on the field that we're in, obviously. Maybe the humanities a bit less, but it's still relevant. So we need to make sure that if we are taking a manuscript that we've already published in Japanese, and we're trying to adapt it for an English audience, we need to update it and make sure that if there are studies that have come out since we published the Japanese version, that we are incorporating those into our manuscript. Another point which I didn't put here, but I think is really important, is we need to look at our bibliography and see what percentage of it is relates to Japanese sources versus what relates to other sources from around the world. We want to make sure that we're well balanced. There's no problem, especially if we're studying Japanese history or culture, to bring many sources and quotes and proof texts from Japanese scholarship and literature. That's fine. But we also want to remember that if we are hoping that this scholarship can be used, and in the bibliography, it's the majority of the texts are in Japanese and are inaccessible to our audience that may prove to be a hindrance to our readership, to our readers who are interested in really being able to get, to understand and to check some of the sources that we've provided. And finally, we want to make sure that if we have been successful in finding a publisher, that we want to that the formatting is more or less in line with the publisher guidelines. Now, this is something that we can help provide as part of our services, but even if not, this is something that you yourselves could do, whether it is preparing your bibliography according to, whatever style sheet, whether it's a Chicago Manual of Style, APA, whatever the publisher guidelines request of us. Sometimes there are details that may be missing in our manuscript that the publisher will want within the bibliography or within the citations. It may be the opposite, and maybe we've provided information that the publisher is not interested in. So we want to, as part of our revision of our manuscript, preparing it for translation or for editing, we want to make sure that we're going through and covering those issues. Okay, I'll give a brief second if anyone wants to chime in with any questions, and if not, we can just go straight ahead to.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the chat or unmute and speak up. We have a relatively small group, about 12 or 13 people here with us today. So if you do have a question, now is a good opportunity to say your piece. And otherwise, we'll hand it back to Avi. Let's give it a minute here and see if anyone has any questions.
Great. So I'll continue, and we can always pause if someone wants to add. Okay, so getting to work on your English manuscript. So let me close my door, which seems to slam in the background. I apologize. Okay, so what do we need to do in order to? Well, let's say we've done all of the cultural adaptations and we fixed up the bibliography, and we have a Japanese manuscript that we think is in good shape and ready to be, and we pitched it to a publisher and we've gotten some interest, and now we're ready to go. So how do we work on the English manuscript? So first of all, we need to find a translator or an editor for our research. And if you're finding a translator, it's ideal to find a translator and an editor, because oftentimes the translation is a great first stage, but it really needs editing to bring the points home and to make sure that everything is clear. Now, it can be a challenge finding a translator editor that not only is a native English speaker, but also has a very high level of Japanese, hopefully native, close to native as well, but also understands your specific field of research and understands the terminology and the concepts and is familiar with the methodologies that are used in your field. Because if we don't find someone who really understands our research, then we can really run into issues of understanding and being able to convey the research in English in a way that, on the one hand, is accurate and honors the original, the source text, because that's our job as translators, is to make sure that we are conveying in an elegant way what the author originally intended, but on the other hand, striking a balance with making sure that the English manuscript reads well on its own, and that if an English reader is going to pick up the book, open it, and start reading through, they're not going to feel that there is remnants of the original Japanese, and that it's difficult for them to understand because the syntax or the grammar is a bit off or a bit stilted. So it's really important that we find the best translator for our manuscript to the greatest extent possible. Now, in order to do that, I can tell you from the field, it is very acceptable to ask a translator for a sample, to see both previous samples of projects that they've worked on in the past, but also to ask the translator for a sample of your text that you're working on in your manuscript. And that way you can really get a feel. I know that in our company, what we do is we actually offer numerous samples. So you can get a feel for the same piece of text. You can see different approaches, different styles to conveying that in English, and then you can choose what's best for you. Now, you may or may not be able to have English on the level that you can really convey, that you can judge what the quality of the research or what the quality of the translation is. But obviously, you all have colleagues, you have Chris at your disposal, who can help you sort of sift through those different samples and make a determination. And you may be surprised that you get a feel, even from a short paragraph, of the style and elegance of the translation, even if English is not your native tongue. Now, I do recommend that if you are using a lot of primary sources and those are already in English, either because they're originally in English and you translated them to Japanese for the purposes of your research, or because they have existing translations in English which are well accepted, you do insert all of those primary sources even before the translation begins. There are times, it's really a case-by-case basis. There are times where it makes sense to translate primary sources from scratch, but there are times where there are perfectly acceptable translations that may need slight adaptations. But if you can put those sources in before, A, it'll save you money from not needing to translate those sources, and B, you already are giving, you're not doing the same work twice, and it gives the translator the ability to understand, to read through, and to make sure that the flow is consistent with those quotes. If you do it afterwards, then the translations that surround that primary source may not fit in exactly with the primary source. So that's why I recommend doing it before. Choose a transliteration style. If there are sources or text within your manuscript that will require transliteration, meaning writing the Japanese and English letters, then it's important to choose a style. Sometimes there can be different styles in terms of pronunciation and how that is conveyed in the transliteration, and it's important to pick a style to be consistent from the start of the project. If you are planning on translating your work, I would recommend preparing a glossary of key terms for the translator before the project begins. If you know that within the industry, within the field, there are certain terms that are well used and well accepted, that are very specialized terms, you can either prepare a separate glossary, or within the text itself, you can put, the first time it appears, you can put in parentheses the term that you would like to use. And in that way, you basically, are avoiding having the translator make their best effort at translating a specific term, you not being satisfied, wanting to switch things up, and having to make a lot of edits and adjustments afterwards. And finally, if you already have interest from a publisher and you know that that publisher has indexes, sometimes this is a really good opportunity when you're going through your manuscript from start to finish again in Japanese to start preparing an index. What terms do you want to use? What terms are going to be important? If someone is looking up a specific, you have to get into the mindset of a reader. If a reader is interested, is theoretically interested in a specific topic within your book, will it be easy for them to find it, or do they have to look through the entire book in order to find the right terms that they're looking for to help them on the road to their research? All right, this just about wraps it up. Just a short word about academic language experts. We are a company that's dedicated to helping academics translate, edit, and format the research for publication. So we help scholars with their book manuscripts, with their articles, journal articles, with their research proposals, lectures at conferences. And again, I want to reinforce the importance of trying to publish in English. If a book manuscript seems too intimidating for you and you want to start with a journal article, I think that's perfectly fine. And I think that you'll find, if you have the right partners and the right guidance, which you do, then it really can open up a whole new world for you. There are opportunities that come as the result of publications that you have done that you wouldn't even be aware of if you just keep your research in Japanese. So obviously it's a very personal decision and you need to consider, to think about it carefully. But if your entire hesitation relates to confidence in your work, or relates to your ability to ensure the quality of English, so you now are aware and have available to you the guidance that you need in order to make sure that your manuscript gets into the right hands and is published in a reputable with a reputable publisher. I want to, if anyone didn't have a chance, you're welcome to again take the link at the bottom of the page. First of all, you're welcome to email me and be in touch with me with any questions or follow up after the session if there was anything that was unclear or that I went through too fast or that I didn't cover that you'd like me to cover, with pleasure. And there's also the link again to put in your details in order to receive both access to our online tools as well as this presentation. I'm sure Chris is recording, so he's going to send it around as well. And I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to come and speak with you today. Obviously, we can open up the floor to any questions. If you prefer to write privately, that's fine as well. And Chris was kind enough to extend the invitation to potentially come and visit in person one day. I really do hope that that becomes a reality. Let's hope that this corona gets behind us sooner rather than later, and that I can come and meet you in person and have the ability to discuss further some of the issues that we started discussing today.
Thank you, Avi, and thank you everybody for joining us. I want to sort of reemphasize here that asking Avi to join us to talk about his experiences as a professional translator, professional manager of other translators, is part of the beginning of a series of ongoing discussions that I'd like to have within the UT-IPI framework with those of you, our core participants, the 13 or 14 of you that joined us today. Thank you very, very, very much. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording now so that I can post that later, and then give you